Today, I've put together some of the most tragic caving disasters I've covered on this channel so far. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to see more documentaries like these. Little Brush Creek Cave is Utah's deepest cave, stretching 6 miles long with a maximum depth of 658 feet. It can only be safely explored in the winter when the water outside is frozen, and the cave's cold interior challenges even the toughest cavers. In 2018, a group of 4 adults met in a rehab clinic. The facility encouraged them to stick together as a group to hold each other accountable and avoid relapse. Together, they embarked on adventures in the wilderness far from the stress and temptations of city life. So far, they had only hiked, but they wanted something more hands-on, something more exciting. They had never gone caving before in their lives, but the name Little Brush Creek sounded harmless. Little did they know, they would soon find themselves in a fight for their lives, trapped in the darkness. Little Brush Creek Cave is located in the Uinta Mountains of Utah at an elevation of 8,000 feet. At those heights, the thin air strains the body of any would-be explorers, wearing out even the strongest athletes. And if people aren't acclimated to the low oxygen content, they could get lightheaded or even faint during outdoor adventures. The top of the Uinta Mountains are composed of non-porous rock, but over time, small cracks allowed water to flow into the soft limestone beneath, which formed a network of tunnels below ground. These conditions create what's known as allogenic caves, and they contain unique formations thanks to the different chemical makeup of the waters that flow within them. The group of 4 young adults, 3 men and 1 woman in their early 20s, were getting stir-crazy in California. The winter months limited their access to the outdoor activities they were using to recover in rehab. That's when they learned about Little Brush Creek Cave from YouTube videos and online blogs. Springtime melt floods the cave, turning it from a dangerous cave into a deadly one. They realized it was the perfect time to explore the cave, which was just 2 states over in Utah. The friends followed an outback trail through the snowy mountains to a clearing that doubles as a parking area. From there, they walk through the deep, powdery snow to a steep hill that meets the side of the Uinta Mountains. Rainwater and melting snow pooled along the wall where the slope meets the rock, forming a large, bell-shaped hole that became the cave's entrance. They climbed down the nearly vertical drop that levels out before the cave. They entered Little Brush Creek Cave around midday. Inside the entrance, crystal-clear icicles mirror the stalactites deeper within, and large, frosty stalagmites catch the light from headlamps to create a neon blue glow. Deeper within, the cave's unique ice structures can reach over 10 feet long. The rocky floor of the entrance allows only around 100 feet of sunlight inside before the cool depths snuff out what little heat the wintry sun provided. Just beyond the shadows, the cavers encountered dozens of stripped and shaped trees that slid down after a logging operation accident that occurred roughly 20 years ago. The accident also sent more rubble into the cave, pinching the first tunnel past the entrance. Little Brush Creek Cave's entry is easy to navigate even for first-time cavers, but the logs do present some unique challenges. The rocky foundation underneath the logs could cause them to dislodge and roll if people disturb them too much. Thin pieces of timber can break apart, splintering and stabbing cavers through their clothing, and other breaks can send wood catapulting toward other cavers. So, watch your step. Past this section, there are multiple paths cavers can take. There's a small tube called the Bobcat Crawl that takes cavers from one side of the mountain to the other, but it's just a straight shot. The group could have trained with this tunnel first, but they wanted the real cave experience. Deeper in, where the rubble ends and the smooth, rocky floor of the cave begins, the cave twists into a curvy slide. Ropes are anchored to the wall, so splunkers can clip and hold onto it for stability as they venture down this steep section. At the bottom, most cavers will encounter Little Brush Creek's first water section, dubbed the Corner Pool and the Glowing Stream. Adventurers must steel their courage and jump into the frigid water as the cold instantly shocks their system, tightening their legs and forcing their lungs to the point of near hyperventilation. the 4 new cavers planned to go through the atrium past the waters, the shower room, the pillar and balcony room, and the black rock room, where the smooth yellowed stone is splintered with regions of shiny black onyx. The group also found a gate with frosty, feather-like crystals growing down from the ceiling and over-rusted metal bars. This area is sometimes called Toothbrush Cave, named for those unique crystals at the entrance. Their research didn't warn them about the vertical passages deep within the cave. These sections of the cave contain vertical pits that are much more dangerous than the main route. Vertical caving can be one of the most dangerous parts of the hobby, as one slip can mean certain death. One of the cave's most daunting sections is a bolted crack that combines vertical caving with another dangerous element, the squeeze. This whole crack is very narrow, and cavers have to traverse it without proper vision of what lies below. Cracks and climbs like these should only be attempted by elite cavers. The team slowly marched forward. 20 to 30 feet past their chosen entrance, Little Brush Creek Cave quickly changes into a slide, formed from a cave-in that brings cavers to a massive 40-foot drop called the Funnel Pit. They weren't far into the cave at this point, but instead of turning around, they made the bold move to climb down the pit. Unfortunately, in their rush to adventure, they skipped all the important details that new cavers must learn about. They were woefully unprepared. They only had 1 small headlamp each, and they had no knee pads, helmets, or batteries. To make matters worse, they were dressed in basic attire, with cotton shirts and regular pants. They were already feeling the consequences of their mistakes just a few hundred feet into the cave. Inside the cave, temperatures average in the 30s, just a few degrees above freezing. Maybe their choice to avoid the main route was a blessing in disguise. If they had traveled the main route, well, they'd likely be frozen before any rescuers could arrive. The 3 shuffled down the funnel and somehow managed to climb down a 40-foot wall. They caught their breath on the next ledge. They only had 2 directions. They could go back up, or try to climb down another roughly 80 to 150-foot cliff. Most of them were already exhausted, but one man was bold enough to attempt the climb without ropes or proper gear. His family called him fearless, and in this moment he proved his mettle, beginning his descent into the darkness without hesitation. He slowly felt around for each foothold and lowered himself down one section at a time. Eventually, he was almost invisible as the light from the other cavers struggled to reach him. They had no idea how far down he was when the elements got to him. He wasn't equipped to deal with the cave's chilly temperatures. He had no extra layers of clothing and no gloves or adequate shoes. The cold made his fingers struggle to hold onto the smooth stone, and his shoes couldn't get enough traction to grip. The newbie caver managed to climb a respectable distance, despite handicapping himself without the proper gear, but unfortunately he lacked one more vital piece of caving equipment: a harness. A harness would allow him some leeway if he made a mistake, and if he got stuck, well, his friends might be able to pull him to safety. With a harness, he might be able to catch himself, stabilize, and begin to rappel or climb down again. But without a harness, he had no chance. The caver took one more step and slipped, plummeting into the darkness below. Some accounts say that the pit he was climbing was roughly 80 feet deep. Others report it was at least 150 feet, which means he fell anywhere from 40 to 100 feet down. He let out a quick cry as he fell. The sound of his flesh bouncing off the cold floor echoed through the pit, followed by his screams of agony. His friends were horrified by his shouts. They stood, trembling, unable to will themselves to climb down and attempt first aid. They tried to turn around and climb back up the first shaft, but the cold and their fear made their knees weak and their hands shake. The 3 remaining cavers couldn't climb out for help. They were all stuck in Little Brush Creek Cave, and one of them was dying. Hours passed by while the 3 remaining cavers struggled with their thoughts as their bodies were assailed by the bitter cold and their injured friend continued to wail in the darkness below. As they sat shivering on the dark ledge, another ghastly thought crept into their minds. They never told anyone they were going caving. They broke the first rule of caving, and now they had to get lucky or die. This grim realization ignited the adrenaline in one of the cavers, and he forced himself to start the climb back up the first 40-foot shaft. His arms trembled at first, but as he made progress, his movements got smoother. The terror dulled the pain of his dry, cracked skin, the sting of the air, and the burn of his muscles. For a while, he paid no attention to the rapid pulse banging in his chest until fatigue set in. The rubbery feeling was gone, but now the cold combined with lactic acid in his muscles to stiffen them, as if he was wearing casts on his arms and legs. Each time he reached for a handhold, he winced in pain. Each time he pushed up with his feet, he felt the sting through his quads. All the while, his friend writhed in pain, howling through the cave. With luck on his side, the brave explorer reached onto the ledge of the funnel room and pulled with all his remaining strength. He made it up the cliff, scrambled through the rocky incline, and ducked under the metal gate wreathed in crystals. He stared at his phone. No reception. He dashed out of the rubble-filled mouth of the cave and stumbled onto the snow, leaving blood-tinged handprints from the cracks along his knuckles. He stared in dismay. There was still no reception. He scrambled up the snowy banks and ran as fast as he could, with each step sinking his legs deep into the snow. Once he reached the clearing by the car, he had enough distance from the massive Uinta Mountains to make the call. But the group's torment was far from over. The people on the other line struggled to understand him as he panted for breath. His sinuses went into overdrive, filling his nose and throat with mucus to protect the delicate tissues of his throat and lungs from the bitter winter air. It made his voice even harder to hear. Once the message got through to the operator, he had more bad news to deal with. The department who received the call had no experience with cave rescues. They would send over any police or firefighters they could spare, but everyone would have to wait for specialists to arrive before they could begin the rescue. Dispatch contacted the National Cave Rescue Commission's Rocky Mountain region, which utilized their call-out service to send the distress signal to any available volunteer rescuers. Multiple on-call volunteers heard the message and agreed to venture to Little Brush Creek Cave, but it would take them nearly 12 hours to reach the parking lot deep in the wilderness. All the while, the injured caver was battling for survival. Once rescuers arrived, they quickly made it to the first ledge, and then down to the injured caver. This section had ropes and anchors, so the properly equipped experts rappelled down in record speed. Once by the patient's side, rescuers saw the damage he had sustained. The fallen caver had numerous severe injuries. It was a miracle he was still alive. His ankle was broken, his pelvis cracked, both wrists were shattered, both elbows were also broken, and as his head ricocheted off the stone floor, the impact also broke his cheekbone, his eye socket, and his jaw. On top of these horrifying injuries, his limbs were turning blue from frostbite. As medics assessed the injured caver, other rescuers helped the remaining man and woman into harnesses. Then, they slowly helped the shivering cavers up the funnel pit. Once up top, they were given extra layers and assessed for any injuries. They weren't in any serious trouble, so they were given the option to wait for their friend or go to the hospital. Down below, the injured caver was faced with an intensely stressful situation. Reports didn't indicate what he and his friends were overcoming in rehab, but the U.S. is still gripped by an opioid epidemic, so it's likely he could have had troubles with pills. If the injured caver was recovering from an addiction to these substances, he would have been faced with a terrible dilemma. His pain was unreal, so medics would likely offer strong painkillers like morphine to make the extraction easier for all parties, but any painkillers could rekindle an addiction. Because of the injuries sustained by the fallen caver, a regular stretcher wouldn't be enough to get him out safely. Instead, they used a litter, which had the same rugged material as a normal stretcher, but with an added basket supporting structure around the outside. This structure provided an extra layer of protection for the patient, and the rigidity of the tubes helped maintain the patient's posture. To help even more, litters like these can also include a spine board, a neck brace, and multiple straps. The Little Brush Creek Cave rescue utilized a Stokes basket model, which was transferred to the rescue site in pieces and reassembled at the extraction point, so rescuers didn't have to carry a bulky and awkward device down the dangerous vertical drops. The model rescuers used was also painted orange, so it would immediately stand out in the light of their headlamps. There was no chance of losing sight of the patient once the operation began. The only downside with this model was the cold. The metal and plastic of the rigid structure could easily become cold enough to cause damage to any exposed skin. But the rescuers solved that problem by wrapping the patient in a thermal blanket, and anyone handling the basket used thick gloves to block the cold. Thankfully, the accident occurred close to the entrance, and there weren't many obstacles for rescuers to overcome. Rescuers could have used the original anchors to save the man and woman trapped on the first ledge, but the injured caver was at the bottom of the second pit. To get him up safely, rescuers had to reinforce a pulley system to reduce the force needed to pull the injured caver up the cliff. That's standard procedure, but the shape of the tunnels challenged the rescuers. The rope had to snake through an L-shaped hole with sharp angles at the top and bottom, followed by a long stretch and then another shaft. It took a few hours to complete, but once the line was in place, rescuers secured the Stokes litter to the rope with tough straps and began hauling the patient up the cave. At one point, they had to stand him up to fit through a narrow crack, but the rescuers helped him through the pain by distracting him with conversation. They asked which actor he'd want to cover him if his rescue ever turned into a movie deal. At 10 a.m., nearly 15 hours after the miraculous distress call reached the dispatch, the injured patient was finally brought to the surface. Rescuers already set up another simple rope system to get the stretcher up the remaining snow-covered slopes, and once they overcame that final obstacle, the patient was safely secured in an ambulance. Further down the road, a medical evacuation helicopter found a safe clearing to land. The two teams rendezvoused at the clearing just beyond the trees, and the man was flown to a hospital in Salt Lake City for emergency treatment. He was in critical condition for a while, which put his friends and loved ones on edge as they prayed for his recovery. Ultimately, he praised the efforts of Salt Lake City Fire Captains David Dixon and Stave Crandall for their heroic and selfless efforts. The injured caver's family started a GoFundMe to help cover the cost of his treatment, and cavers from all over the world joined together to raise nearly $8,000 for the injured explorer. The group of 4 newbie cavers had respectable rehab goals, but their story is a reminder that caves don't care about the lives of those who venture inside. Caves will claim lives instantly and without remorse, so always be prepared if you dare to venture deep below ground. Florida resident Bruce Brewer was an excellent caver who spent hundreds of hours exploring below ground. One day, he took a group of 7 novice spelunkers on a tour through Georgia's Climax Caverns. It was a route he had traveled dozens of times before, but this time he found something new, something shocking. High waters blocked the path to their exit, but Brewer wanted to press forward. Just as he began scouting the flooded sump, everything went wrong. Join us as we explore the haunting story of Bruce Brewer and the Climax Cave. 33-year-old Bruce Brewer was an instructor of photojournalism at Florida A&M University and a freelance photographer for both the Associated Press and the Tallahassee Democrat publications. Brewer lived in the Florida Panhandle his whole life, though his multiple talents and exceptional caving skills enabled him to travel all across the U.S. He was the perfect candidate for government-sponsored cave expeditions, and he was selected by the United States Forestry Service to venture into caves all across the U.S., from Florida to Alaska, and even across the waters to Puerto Rico and Hawaii. Brewer could tackle pretty much any cave he came across, but he was especially adept at exploring his local cave, Climax Caverns. Climax Cave is located near a drainage basin in Georgia's southwestern Decatur County. The Apalachicola River, the Chattahoochee River, and the Flint River combine to form the collective ACF River Basin, which converges at Decatur County. Some of these rivers start at the Georgia mountain range before combining into a single channel that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. The waters above ground created the perfect conditions to form caves like the one Brewer was preparing to explore. Climax Cave is around 225 miles south of Atlanta, and it's around 6 hours away from Florida's most populated cities, so many cavers have to plan for long trips to reach the cave. But Brewer only had to travel an hour to reach Climax Caverns from his lifelong home in Tallahassee, Florida. Climax Cave is named after a nearby town which was the terminus or end of a railroad in the 1800s. This cave was Brewer's home turf. He had been documenting Climax Caverns for over 10 years. And on top of all his other jobs and accolades, Brewer also wrote articles about his caving adventures. On Saturday, July 12, 2003, Brewer led a group of 7 cavers into Georgia's Climax Caverns. The team was well equipped with water-resistant socks, 2 pairs of shirts, knee pads, helmets, headlamps, flashlights, and backup batteries. They also brought cameras, a waterproof dry bag and a dry box, a vacuum bottle, and food supplies. Climax Cave has over 8 miles of cataloged passages, making it the second longest dry cave in the state of Georgia. It's been explored many times, but it is a real cave with deadly challenges that lie in wait. The cave is situated on private land near a highway and a dirt road. Only members of the National Speleological Society can access the cave, with permission from the landowner. After parking along a freshly manicured lawn by the highway, Brewer and his team trekked across a trail teeming with plants as they ventured into the forest. It wasn't long before they reached the entrance to Climax Caverns. The mouth of the cave could look like a pothole or a large vertical drop from afar. Upon closer inspection, the entrance slides down with a roughly 7-foot drop, followed by a steep crack that leads to another ledge. After a shorter step down and a total descent of 30 feet, the cave's entrance connects to a low-hanging ceiling that cavers squeeze through to enter the rest of the cave. Brewer was leading a team composed of ecologists from a research center. This caving trip wasn't an expedition into uncharted territory, but rather a simple tour that could encourage the researchers to further study Climax Cave and the unique wildlife found within its cold, dark interiors, like the Doherty plain crayfish and the Georgia blind salamander. Millions of years ago, Georgia was underwater, and dead sea creatures sank to the bottom of the waters. That ground would later become the site of Climax Cave, so even today, explorers can still find new fossils buried beneath the layers of limestone. The crew also brought sound equipment to record the calls of the various bat colonies found within the cave's dark corridors. But in spite of their scientific ambitions, Brewer was the only real caver there. All 7 researchers were new to the world of caving. For some, this trip to Climax Cave was their first time ever exploring a cave. Bruce wasn't worried. He knew this cave like the back of his hand. With his fearless attitude, he and his team entered Climax Caverns around noon. After winding down into the cave, their headlamps lit up the first large chamber. The ceiling dips down in waves, with many smooth ripples in the stone shaped by the flow of water over untold millennia. The first chamber is large, with shallow streams intersecting the pathway. There are 3 routes cavers can take once they enter this room. The first is a massive hole that descends further down. This section requires harnesses and ropes, so cavers need to be trained in vertical caving to explore deeper down this eerie pitfall. That option was a no-go. Then, there's a shaft that usually has water trickling down it. But despite the hazard, this path can be climbed without much trouble. And last, there's the chimney tube that can be climbed down, but it enters into the ceiling of another passage, so cavers must be suspended or risk injury by dropping down roughly 4 feet onto the floor below the tube. Bruce took them around what's known as the Loop, which was the usual route for tours. This route brings cavers through Climax Caverns' many awe-inspiring rooms, but it also poses some challenges that could be difficult for new cavers. The cavers journeyed onward through the Sand Crawl, a long, narrow tunnel where cavers scraped their stomachs and grasped the mud and stone while slowly worming their way through. In some areas, there's only a few inches separating the floor and ceiling for most of the passage, but there's just enough of a bell-shaped curve for cavers to pinch their way through. Today, the sand crawl is gated shut to prevent would-be explorers from getting stuck. Only experienced cavers or groups led by experts can venture further. Beyond the claustrophobic squeeze of the sand crawl, the ecologists were amazed by frosty speleothems, smooth, round stalactites dripping mineral water from the ceiling, rounded cairns, and calcite flowers that seemed to bloom across the cave walls. Eventually, they reached the Blue Hole Lake Room, which is accessed via a cliff that drops down into water. Below the slippery, rounded ledge, the cavers saw a clear pool of water with multiple fin-like shelves marking the various water lines the pool has dug over the years. Nearby, the team was amazed to find cave paintings and artifacts from the early days of the U.S. expansion into the land. The cavers then reached Razor Hall. They descended down a slippery ramp into a huge chamber filled with speleothems, rock formations created by various minerals interacting with flowing water. This chamber continues down to a low-hanging ceiling on the rocky shore of a mysterious lake. The water is only knee-deep for a while, allowing cavers to tiptoe their way to an enormous column of smooth dripstone with a stone beard dipping into the water. Just past the large rock formation in the pond, the ceiling juts down to divide Razor Hall into another chamber called the Turnage Room. Venturing past the structure, the water gets deeper until the ground gives way, revealing a tunnel that's partly submerged, a sump, or a flooded U-shaped tunnel. Bruce had expected the water levels to be low enough to cross the area through a narrow ledge, but the ledge was submerged. As a long-time veteran of Climax Cave, Bruce knew the history of these sumps. He recalled, on May 15, 1976, Guy Bryant, Bill Donahue, Court Smith, and David Nolan explored the South Climax Cave portion to venture beyond the sumps and expand the cave. They came back a month later with only one breathing tube, one pressure gauge, and one air tank each. They discovered that some of the pumps dried out during periods of low precipitation, and after many dives over the next few months, they managed to map out thousands of extra passages. Bryant's team was able to tackle the sumps with their old technology and with minimal gear, so the sumps shouldn't be that dangerous, right? Still, the water at Razor Hall confused Brewer. He knew that the water levels should be lower this time of year, and he knew he could tackle them, but even during the rainy season, this passage had never been that deep. He hadn't seen anything like this before. After all, George's Climax Cavern is supposed to be a dry cave. Bruce knew the cave had some flooded sections deeper down, but they weren't exploring that route. They reached this section around 8 p.m. Saturday night. They needed to cross into the Turnage Room to complete the loop. There were still more marvels to behold on the other side, and the team had been in the cave for over 9 hours at this point. Turning around could be just as dangerous as pushing forward. They were all amateurs, so if something went wrong, Brewer couldn't save them all by himself. Brewer thought about the situation. Since the water was never this high, it was likely that the sump was only a few feet long at most. That would mean that the group could simply duck under the ceiling to reach the other side. They'd only need to hold their breath for a moment, and they could form a human chain so that they couldn't get lost. If that didn't work, the team would have to turn around. Bruce decided to check out how deep the water really was. He waded across the water and over to the partition in the room. After glancing through the water, he made up his mind. Bruce had explored Climax Cave over 100 times, and he personally led dozens of groups along this same route. He was not going to let this strange flood halt their progress. Bruce informed his team that he would check out the passage to see if they could safely advance. He got rid of any excess gear, swam through the deep waters to the partition, took a gulp of stagnant cave air into his lungs, and dove below the surface of the water. Bruce was performing one of the most dangerous maneuvers in caving, free diving with no tanks of air, no goggles, and no rope to guide his path forward. The team of ecologists talked and looked around the room. Bruce said he shouldn't be gone long, so they waited patiently. The average adult can only hold their breath for 30 to 90 seconds. Bruce, as a physically fit caver, would likely be on the upper end. But as a minute passed by inside the chamber, the cavers began to get restless. They stared at the pool of water. its surface still and unbroken. No waves marked his hurried ascent. No bubbles indicated his arrival. The cavers stood in uncomfortable silence. One of the cavers was unsettled and asked if Brewer should be back by now. They said yes, but maybe he got to the other side and he was checking to make sure there weren't more sumps ahead. They agreed that would be the smart move. He was an expert. He knew what he was doing and they should trust him. But time kept ticking away. As more time elapsed, they turned off their lights to avoid wasting their precious batteries. That's when they saw a glow below the water. It had to be coming from Bruce's lamp. A few cavers swam to the partition and tried to reach for Bruce without fully going underwater. They had to cling to the slippery ceiling and the walls as they stretched toward the light. If they let go, they were afraid they wouldn't be able to make it back. The light was too far away. They couldn't reach Bruce. Another group decided to check side passages to see if he made it through to the other side of the sump. No sign of Brewer. After their search turned up empty, the cavers splintered into groups. One group would stay behind and nervously scout the waters, hoping for any sign of Brewer, while another group would call for a rescue team. Outside of Climax Cave, the scared team of ecologists initiated a search and rescue mission at around 2 a.m., 4 hours after Brewer vanished into Climax Cavern's seemingly endless waterlogged tunnel. 2 members of the local sheriff's office, who were also cave divers, answered the emergency call. They made it to Climax Cave straight away, but after seeing the absurd water levels, they called a Georgian caver, Will Summer, to help them. He was a local splunker who knew the cave about as well as Bruce did. Equipped with proper scuba gear, Summer and the other divers ducked below the sump. They hoped that Bruce's headlamp got caught on the jagged ceiling and he'd made it to the other side. If he surfaced without his headlamp, he wouldn't dare attempt the return trip blind. In that scenario, Bruce should be waiting on the other side of the pool, but that's not what happened. The cave divers quickly found the source of the light, and it was still attached to him. Bruce Brewer, the teacher and guide who inspired thousands of new cavers, was dead at the bottom of Climax Cave. His body was around 11 feet below the water. It took the team only a few minutes to bring his body out of the pool and onto the rocky shores of Razor Hall. However, with only 3 rescuers, they couldn't immediately bring his body to the surface. The heartbroken rescuers trudged their way to the forest above Climax Cave at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. After relaying the tragic news, cavers from far and wide drove straight to Georgia to bring Bruce to the surface for a proper burial. Over 130 rescuers joined forces in the recovery effort. The group was tired and demoralized, shocked at the loss of their local legend, friend, and fellow caver. Many of the cavers knew him through his work. Rescuers worked in shifts throughout the night, but many took extra breaks to grieve. Those who could collect themselves slowly began laying down rope, drilling anchors, and securing the exit route for their fallen friend. The first 3 rescuers who found him barely slept. They immediately ventured back inside to complete the recovery mission. Rescuers had to use chisels and air hammers to blast some of the crawl spaces apart to fit the stretcher that carried Bruce. It took the team the rest of Sunday to complete the extraction, while the crews struggled to come to terms with the disaster. By 4:19 a.m. on Monday morning, the rescuers returned Bruce's body to the surface of the Georgian forest. In one of the most gorgeous rooms of the cave, surrounded by the impossible structures only found deep underground, the cavers secured a memorial plaque that reads, "In memory of Bruce H. Brewer, caver, photographer, conservationist, and teacher. Your light will always shine." Bruce's story is both a warning to never underestimate the deadly power of nature and a celebration of those brave explorers who expanded maps and inspired cavers and nature lovers all over the world to carry the torch and forge their own stories of struggle, exploration, danger, and triumph as they venture into the untold depths of Earth's caves.
We're approaching the anniversary of one of the most dreadful cave stories of all time. In Thailand, on June 23, 2018, 12 members from a youth junior soccer team named the Wild Boars ventured into the Tam Luang Nang Nong cave for a birthday party after a tough day of practice. The team of 12 boys aged 11 to 17 were chaperoned by their assistant coach Ekafon Chantuang. The whole event was catered, and it should have been a simple, fun time for the team. but their relaxing party underground quickly turned into a fight for survival when a monsoon stormed through the dense forest, bringing a sudden flood of water that wouldn't let up. The downpour sealed the entrance to the cave, trapping 13 people in the damp, rocky depths. Pirapat Sompiengje had just turned 17, but the rainfall was an unwelcome surprise for the birthday boy and the rest of the party. The tunnel leading to their party area was slanted downward, so the water started flooding inside and filling up narrow portions of the tunnel. The escape route was already too far to swim to safety. The team's assistant coach had to act fast to save the boys from the rising water. As they fled deeper into the cave, they left behind some of their food and supplies. Fleeing might have been their only option, but it presented a host of new problems. There are many different kinds of caves. None of them are comfortable to be trapped in, but some are worse than others. The Tam Luang Cave is a karstic cave formed by erosion of small rocks like limestone and dolomite. These caves create vast expanses of twisting and winding tunnels that extend for miles underground. The wild boars were drawn further into the cave, dubbed the Great Cave of the Sleeping Lady, near the top of the Doi Nang Nong Mountain in the Thai highlands. Legend has it that long ago a princess fell in love with a farm worker and planned to have a child out of wedlock. The royal family would forbid their marriage, so the princess and her sweetheart ran away and hid in the cave. The man left to search for food, but the royal family, led by the princess's father, caught the man and killed him. In her sorrow, the princess stabbed herself to death, and her blood became the water that courses through the veins of the Tam Luang Cave. As ages passed, the mountain itself grew into her likeness, and now the mountain range resembles the princess with long hair lying down. The boys and their chaperone had to contend with superstition, but more pressing matters were quickly taking over. The main chamber where the party was held is almost 300 feet long, but this main area branches into a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and vertical recesses that stretch for 6.4 miles in total, soul-crushing darkness. Shortly after nightfall, the head coach for the team, Naparat Kantawang, looked at his phone and found over 20 missed calls. As he checked his messages, he realized that none of the boys had made it home. He called the assistant coach and dialed some of the boys' cell phones, but the signals were blocked by the dense forest and solid stone that entombed the soccer team. Eventually, Naparat actually contacted one of the boys. Songpong was picked up by his parents after soccer practice, and he told the coach that the rest of the team went to explore the Great Cave of the Sleeping Lady. The coach took personal responsibility for the team and his assistant, and he fled his house to reach the mouth of the cave. As he arrived in the pouring rain, he saw bags and bicycles all abandoned as rainwater and mud gushed from the sealed entrance of Tam Luang. Then, the head coach contacted authorities to report 13 missing people. Word quickly spread as police gathered tracking canines to probe the surface for sinkholes and shafts that could reach down into the cave as an escape route. At the time, radar and other scanning equipment wasn't strong enough to locate the team from the surface. Drones were also used to explore the cave to little success. Meanwhile, social media, word of mouth, and news coverage all caught the attention of world-class divers. Vern Unsworth is a British national who lives in the area. He's also a cave explorer, or caver, who's explored the Tam Luang cave complex many times, and he suggested that the Thai government contact the British Cave Rescue Council. 2 days after the team went missing, Thai Navy SEAL divers came to the rescue, only they didn't succeed. The monsoon brought continuous rain that churned up sediment and made the water almost opaque. Their special underwater lights were no use. They couldn't see anything when they tried to swim into the cave. Days passed, and more rain continued to flood into Tam Luang. On June 27th, 3 members of the British Cave Rescue Council made it to Thailand, and shortly afterward, more independent teams came to lend their aid. The BCRC brought better equipment designed specially for cave rescues, but their searches were fruitless. All the while, the wild boars and their coach were stuck wandering through damp, stagnant air as the thin, waning light from their dying flashlights cast ominous, ghastly shadows on the stalactites and stalagmites that threatened to engulf them around every turn. The next day, the 353rd Special Operations Group, the 320th Special Tactics Squadron, and the 31st Rescue Squadron from the U.S. Air Force arrived. A day later, a specialist response group from the Australian Federal Police arrived, followed by Chinese divers from the Beijing Peaceland Foundation. Maxim Polyaka, Richard Stanton, Ben Raymanon, and John Valanthan made headway on the rescue by placing diving guidelines, but the mission had to be paused when more rain created strong currents. On July 2nd, 9 days after the boys and their coach went missing, the weather finally let up. That day, BCRC diver Robert Harper conducted support from outside the cave as 2 divers explored the depths. Valanthan and Stanton were exploring the cave, placing guidelines. Valanthan ran out of line and swam to the surface. He smelled something immediately recognizable. As he looked around the chamber, he found the missing birthday party, alive but sweaty, dirty, exhausted, and frightened. The Thai Navy SEALs posted a video of this miracle encounter to Facebook. In the video, the boys have all lost sense of time. The darkness had eroded their senses and fear has dulled their otherwise smiling faces. Although it was a blessing to find the team alive, the battle was far from over. The group was found in a chamber that lay deep beneath the highest point of the mountain. To reach it from the surface, nearly half a mile of rock would need to be excavated, but the horizontal path was just as bad. The group was roughly 2.5 miles from the entrance, and the path toward them was riddled with steep slopes and narrow corridors that were too small to carry scuba tanks through. It dawned on rescuers that the real challenge was just beginning. Any capable swimmer can tackle a mile-long swim in around 30 minutes, but this situation was much more dire. The winding caverns meant that divers had to traverse carefully. Any wrong move could risk slicing their equipment or their flesh open on the jagged rocks that surrounded them from all sides. Plus, rescuers needed to carry extra equipment and supplies to deliver to the trapped soccer team, which would also slow them down. The weight of the mission would impact their very physiology, causing their adrenaline to spike as they breathe faster under the pressure of saving so many innocent lives. As they breathe faster, their oxygen tanks deplete faster. And there's one final problem: the return trip. The average scuba tank can only hold enough air for 45 to 60 minutes. The high stakes and difficult terrain could cause rescuers to spend far longer than an hour just to reach them, not counting the time to return back to the entrance to refill their tanks. To make matters worse, some of the boys never learned how to swim. To make supply trips more efficient, the team set up an air supply refill area in a chamber partway through the cave. Thai Army doctor Lieutenant Colonel Pak Laharachan joined the team to provide health checks on the boys. The rescue team realized the importance of morale and positive psychology, so they also tried to keep the team entertained as best as they could in the muddy nightmare they were trapped in. To raise their own spirits and give hope to their families, the team each introduced themselves in a video posted by the Thai Navy SEALs. While the effort was noble, the team looked frail as they huddled in emergency blankets. In a more genuine effort of kindness, BCRC diver Jason Mallinson asked each team member if they wanted to send personal messages to their friends and family in writing. Jason had with him a special wet notes pad that could write on land or underwater. Meanwhile, their coach Ekafon also played a vital role in keeping the boys safe despite his blunder of ignoring the warning signs posted at the cave entrance. Alongside soccer, he also trained as a Buddhist monk. He led the boys in guided meditation, which has been scientifically shown to reduce anxiety and improve other areas of health, and it may have helped them process the trauma they were faced with day after day, trapped in the abyss. On the surface, an entire camp was constructed to figure out how the team would rescue the 13 people trapped in Tam Luang. The team discovered it took them 6 hours to reach the boys because they had to battle against the current, and it took them 5 hours to exit. To make it easier for the divers, different teams constructed a dam to divert upstream rivers, and other teams created a pump system to remove as much water as they could from the rapidly flooding cave. By July 4th, experts estimated that they had pumped out 420,000 gallons of water, which is close to the total volume of an Olympic swimming pool. This helped the divers, but it also flooded nearby farms and destroyed their crops. The rescuers were also surprised by an unusual dry spell that helped reduce the water level in the cave. On July 5th, 38-year-old former Thai Navy SEAL diver Saman Kunan volunteered to help, and he dove into the cave to deliver 3 air tanks to the Midway refill site. He dropped off the tanks, but on his own way back, he lost consciousness. His dive partner attempted CPR, but he was unsuccessful. They went back to Chamber 3 with the air tanks, and Kunan's dive buddy tried CPR again, but it was too late. Kunan was pronounced dead in the early hours of July 6th. Tragically, this wasn't the only life claimed in the Tam Luang rescue operation. A year after the heroic mission, another Thai SEAL, Beirut Pakbera, died from a blood infection he acquired in the cave. Later that day, on July 6th, the rescue camp detected low oxygen levels in the chamber where the boys were waiting to be rescued, which could lead to hypoxia and permanent damage or even death if they weren't rescued soon. 2 days later, oxygen levels dropped below the levels needed for normal human function. Time was running out. Weather forecasters predicted that another monsoon was fast approaching. By the end of the week, the cave would be reflooded and the rain wouldn't recede for another 3 months. The team had days to save the boys and their coach, or they were doomed. On July 8th, the extraction began. 18 rescue divers took part in the mission, and the boys were rescued in order of who volunteered first. The days of good food and encouragement helped the boys face the challenge head-on, as they were filled with hope for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Some of the wild boars weren't looking forward forward to the bike ride home after a grueling time trapped in a cave. It hadn't dawned on them that the whole world was supporting them and hoping for their rescue. All 12 boys and their coach were given wetsuits, harnesses, buoyancy jackets, and positive pressure full face masks that were attached to tanks with 80% oxygen on their chest. The harnesses had handles that allowed them to be tethered to a rescue diver for added safety if they got lost in the low visibility areas of the cave. To prevent panic, the boys were also given a cocktail of drugs. The first was a drug known for both its anesthetic and psychedelic properties, ketamine. The dosage was enough to knock them out without interfering with their breathing. They were also given Xanax and atropine to prevent anxiety and keep their heart rate steady. These drugs needed to be administered multiple times along the journey to freedom. Once the boys reached Chamber 3, where the oxygen was stored, they were passed along a chain of hundreds of rescuers, wrapped in sked stretchers, slid, zip-lined, and carried by a system of pulleys to the entrance of the cave. On July 10th, the last of the boys and the coach were rescued. The last people to leave were the 3 Thai Navy SEALs and the Army doctor. But as they were leaving, the water pumps were suddenly shut off. Thankfully, they were the most experienced members of the group by this point, and they were able to escape in record time before the rising water levels cut off the exit. After 18 days, the wild boars and their assistant coach were free from the Tam Luang cave. The boys were placed on a special diet and given sunglasses so they could readjust to regular light for the first time in weeks. When all was said and done, roughly 10,000 people helped in some capacity during the Tam Luang cave incident. Over 100 divers lent their aid, and over 100 government agencies took part in the rescue effort. An episode of National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, called Thai Cave Rescue, recalls the events. Thai-Irish filmmaker Tom Waller wrote and directed a movie called The Cave, which is based on Tam Luang. And just last year, in 2021, a full documentary was released called The Rescue. That's the exhilarating story of the Tam Luang cave rescue.
In 2008, a caving couple entered New Zealand's Lucky Strike Cave. Nearly an hour into their journey, one of the cavers, a 32-year-old woman, stopped for a moment to rest near a gorgeous waterfall. Suddenly, catastrophe struck and she suffered serious injuries. Her male counterpart was forced to make the agonizing choice: stay with her until help arrives, or leave her alone in the darkness to go get help. Find out what he chose and if his partner survived in the Lucky Strike Cave rescue. Caving has been a popular hobby and tourist activity ever since the New Zealand Speleological Society was founded back in 1949. Hundreds of thousands of people travel to New Zealand to explore the caves, with the majority of visitors traveling to the Waitomo district, where hundreds of caves extend deep into the earth. The name Waitomo comes from the local Maori language, which roughly translates to water flowing through sinkholes. Waitomo tunnels, like the glowworm caves, are world famous for their populations of Arachnocampa luminisa, unique glowworms found only in New Zealand. While many of these caves are tourist attractions for non-cavers, some caves give real spelunkers a run for their money. Today's story takes place in Lucky Strike Cave, considered one of the toughest caves in the country. Lucky Strike is owned privately by the Chandler family, though they do allow experienced cavers to explore its dark reaches. It takes pro cavers 3 to 4 hours to reach the back end of Lucky Strike, and that's only if they're skilled enough to make it all the way through. Recently, cavers Mike Allen and Dave Ellicott tried to explore Lucky Strike to find a connection between its end and the Junior Mudball cave system. Jane Furkett and her partner got permission to explore the cave together. They thought they had been through everything caves could throw at them, so they were prepared and physically fit for the sporty challenge. Soon after entering, the pair found a long, narrow room with hundreds of straws, needles of calcium carbonate or sulfate dripping mineral water from the ceiling. Unlike regular stalactites, these straws are hollow, which makes them far more fragile. These delicate formations take thousands of years to develop, but a gentle poke will send them crashing down to the floor. The pair crouched through the section, ducking just under the straws. Beyond this area, Lucky Strike requires cavers to spread their legs across a jagged crack and almost jump from side to side to move across the chasm. Other areas require cavers to push their feet and hands against 2 walls and move forward across the gap. This technique is known as bridging, and both of these dangerous sections are usually done without ropes. so one wrong move could easily lead to certain death. Luckily, the ground here is usually dry. The lights of their headlamps moved across glistening speleoforms, casting warped shadows along the cave walls. Haunted by the sound of dripping water and the eerie stillness of the cave, the two splunkers tied themselves together to traverse undulating sections of smooth stone. The rope gave them some stability and security in case one fell, and they needed to have the rope ready for the next area. The next pitch opened high above the previous area. To get across safely, they attached their gear bags to a rope and pushed it across the large chasm. Then they attached their own harnesses and zip-lined across to the other side. From there, they would abseil up the rock face. This technique is like the climbing version of rappelling. This technique uses a double rope affixed to a high point in case they slip and fall. Near the end of the cave, they'd have to dig their way through mud and rock to push through narrow tunnels to the exit. There, water levels can easily push into the face of cavers while rocks stab into their sides. The area here is very similar to the atmosphere of the nearby Junior Cave with its thick and endless tunnels of mud. However, these two cavers wouldn't make it that far. Beyond a large, slanted room full of boulders, Lucky Strike opens into a riverbed. To explore the end of the cave, the two had to walk against the flow of the water while a steady shower drips from overhead along the pathway. To overcome faster flowing sections, cavers affixed a rope along the side of the river. This connects to a thin bridge of rounded stone that leads upward. By now, the cold was getting severe. The ceaseless flow of water constricted their fingers. Their torsos went rigid as blood flow diverted to their central organs and their muscles tightened. Furkett was climbing up the side of the riverbed chamber when she reached a small ledge. She unhooked a traverse line that connected to the next section to take a break. Big mistake. Her foot gave way. The rope quickly tethered as her weight suddenly dropped into her harness. Her fingers, still numb and wet from the cold, damp chamber, couldn't grip the rope that was moving with the force of her entire body. The rope slid from her hands, whipping through the anchors as she tumbled backwards. Her legs shot up toward the ceiling, and her body instinctively bent forward, trying to grab the rope. She saw the wall blur past as her vision moved to the ceiling. As her arms hung in the air, she had no time to scream. She landed on her bottom at the floor of Lucky Strike Cave. Jane's partner called to her above the sound of the rushing water. He got to her as fast as he could. She was still conscious and groaning in pain. One of her hands instinctively went to her side, and the other covered her mouth. As the man approached her, his lamp cast a grim light onto her face. She had fallen nearly 30 feet down, and her hand was dripping with blood that looked almost orange as the yellow light reflected back into his eyes. He asked if she was all right, and she spat thick globs of blood as she tried to respond. The pain kept her from speaking full sentences. She tried to respond in gasps, and as she spoke, he saw some of her teeth had shattered. Some broken teeth were lodged in her gums, while the stumps of others leaked blood, like the hollow straws near the cave's entrance. Her head was on fire with pain, but this injury wasn't bad enough to keep her stuck here. She wasn't even focused on the blood or the pain from her teeth when she spoke. Instead, she muttered that her hip was in pain. The other caver tried to gently touch her side to see if he could pinpoint where the pain was and what was wrong. She jerked away. The amount of pain Furkett was experiencing could only mean one thing. Her hip had been shattered by the fall. The waters of Lucky Strike continued to slam into them both. Realizing the cold river would quickly overtake them, he told her that she would have to brace herself. He raised her upper body as best as he could and slowly dragged her down the river. She slipped from his grasp, and he stumbled to catch her. His ankle nearly twisted from the sudden maneuver over the top of smooth, wet rocks of the riverbed. Jane nearly hyperventilated to prevent herself from screaming in pain as it seared through her whole body. Miraculously, her fellow caver pulled her from the water to a drier section of the cave, but the waters would still pose a threat. As adrenaline gripped her body, she wouldn't be able to notice her own body temperature. The adrenaline constricted her blood vessels and sped up her heart rate. making hypothermia more likely to claim her fingers and toes, and eventually her life. The other caver knelt by her side. He reached for first aid, but he fumbled with the gauze as his thoughts raced. To prevent her from freezing, he wrapped their survival blanket around her. She tried to grab it, but her bloodied hands caused it to slip from her grasp. He tried to be noble and told her he wouldn't leave her, they'd make it out together. As time passed by, her shock continued to get worse. She told him that staying here would be the death of them both. He had to go get help. Now. Hesitant to leave her behind, he took off most of his extra equipment and rushed back through the boulder chamber and across the bridging gap. He stumbled through the cave straws, not caring about anything other than saving her life. He had to get out of the cave. Once outside, he contacted emergency rescue crews. Police, search and rescue volunteers, ambulance medics from the nearby St. John, and caving experts all arrived to lend their aid. In total, 25 people came to Jane's aid. Rescuers knew Lucky Strike was a difficult cave. They needed a stretcher with a body harness to keep her secure during the long ride out of the cave. These stretchers have a solid plate to provide stability, along with long sides and flaps for the head and feet. They use colored straps so rescuers can easily connect them in the dark without mixing up the order, which would cause the stretcher to dump the injured caver to their death. The mostly enclosed stretcher would allow the team to lift Jane at angles and around tight corners. The cave entrance was a 20-minute drive from the nearby town along narrow country roads, but slowly, rescuers lined the roads as they congregated at the mouth of the cave. The rescuers split into teams and stormed into the cave. The fall happened around 2:30 p.m., and nearly 4 hours later, the first rescue crew was still trying to progress through Lucky Strike. Their progress was slowed because some of the rescuers needed to move carefully and slowly while rigging a haul system for the stretcher. The river wasn't a straight path. It had twists that got narrower over time, and it had waterfalls. Usually, cavers would use the ropes to climb around the waterfalls, but rescuers would need to make a straight pathway through the raging waters. As rescuers continued to create an exit path for Jane, another volunteer from the Auckland Westpac Rescue Helicopter Trust pushed on ahead alone into Lucky Strike. This rescuer was not only a skilled caver, but also an advanced paramedic with tons of experience in high-pressure situations. They knew that the rigging lines were vital to the saving of Jane's life, but the paramedic knew that Jane needed immediate medical attention or the ropes would be useless. The paramedic arrived at Furkett's location hours before the rest of the crew and found Jane was still alive, but her soaked clothes were causing her to lose body heat fast. Her hip injury wasn't life-threatening. Instead, hypothermia was her greatest enemy. The paramedic stabilized her leg and torso to prevent further damage to her bones and to reduce the nerve pain that was crippling her where she lay. Meanwhile, lines were rigged high above the ground in many places to give the stretcher enough room to dip around the corners and avoid the hazards below. They loaded her into the bright orange cocoon. Her stretcher swayed perilously above the dark abyss, far further than her earlier fall. Her fate rested in the skills of the rescuers who had quickly anchored the pulleys and ropes just hours earlier. Wriggling or jerky movements in the stretcher could cause anchors to dislodge. It could cause rescuers to drop her, or sudden movements could throw them all off their pathway and send them all crashing to their own deaths. To avoid her accidentally wrecking the rescue plan, they administered painkillers to dull the brutal pain that radiated through her core. At 1:30 a.m., nearly 12 hours after her painful ordeal started, Jane was finally freed from the grasp of Lucky Strike Cave. The awaiting ambulance drove her out of the forest into the nearby town, where a helicopter took her to the Waikato Hospital. Once there, she was treated for hypothermia, and her condition stabilized. Rescuers said this was one of the most challenging rescue operations in New Zealand's history, thanks to the physically demanding nature of Lucky Strike and the complicated pathway of the rigging line. This difficult cave continues to attract cavers, but only the bravest and most adept cavers should even consider risking their lives beyond the straws, the gaps, and the waterfalls hidden deep below ground in Lucky Strike Cave. Snow drifted through a cold, gray sky on Christmas morning 2011 as a 39-year-old caver descended into a cave system in northern UK. He was treating himself and his friends to a holiday excursion in Britain's longest cave system. Once they reached Molluscan Hall, his Christmas celebration turned into a nightmare. In an instant, one caver was knocked unconscious and trapped below the freezing ground while his friends desperately tried to save him. This is the story of the Molluscan Hall rescue. Molluscan Hall is a section of Britain's longest cave network, the Easgill Cave System. Bill Taylor and George Carnot first discovered Easgill back in 1946, and since then, spelunkers found that this system connects over 10 different caves. The whole system is over 41 miles long, and it's sometimes called the Three Counties Cave System because it tunnels beneath Cumbria, Lancashire, and North Yorkshire. The caves here are composed of Carboniferous and Great Scar limestone that's been eroded over time as waters collect and drain into Lech Beck. The man behind this story asked the news not to release his name, so we'll call him Charles. Charles was over 6 feet tall and hefty. Caving is best suited for small and thin individuals. Smaller people can better contort through tight passages, and less body weight means the body's muscles don't have to work as hard to move. Both of these benefits make caving easier, leading to better stamina and less fatigue during long caving sessions. In Charles's favor, his body weight gave him better insulation against the cold, which was good since the snowy weather chilled the already cold caves. Charles could always handle himself in any situation he encountered, but his build could become a problem if he was encumbered or injured. To get to Molluscan Hall, the team of 3 cavers could enter through multiple routes. They were advanced spelunkers, so they went for a dangerous route. They entered the Easgill system via a mysterious passage that was hidden from cavers for over 25 years. They took the route from Mancunian Way, which is near the exit of Corna Cavern. From the exit of Corna, the team traveled along the mossy rock walls and trampled over carpets of decaying leaves that piled up in the divot where the ground and stone meet. Eventually, they come across a thin opening where a slab had dislodged and rolled away. Through this narrow squeeze, they reached a hole in the ground. One by one, the party descended the small hole in the ground feet first, unable to see what lay below them. When Charles started the descent, he immediately realized this route could be a problem. His hefty frame turned the cave's very first obstacle into a real struggle. His face went red as he held his breath to shrink his waist, giving him just barely enough space to push downward. Once at the bottom, they had to crouch in a tunnel that was filled with bits of gravel from years of water flow. Should the snow overhead turn to water, their entrance could become a shower. They'd lose their footing as the flow starts to pull rocks down the passageway. So far, they were lucky enough. The pebbled floor was only glistening with a thin layer of dew. After several feet of altering terrain, the cavers found themselves in a muddy room that gave them some space to stretch out. But their fortune wouldn't last long. They had to duck into another hole that connected to more gravel. Next, they had to suffer through another claustrophobic squeeze as they wormed across the rough rocks below. From there, the cavers found a room of large boulders. Charles marveled at the huge mounds of stone. Cavers are forbidden to touch many of the delicate rock formations found in caves to prevent them from being broken. Even a little bit of excess mud, oil from his skin, or acidity from his sweat could cause damage to rare and intricate speleoforms. However, these boulders were just plain rock, so he allowed himself to drag his palms across their rough surface. He looked up at the ceiling and wondered how these massive stones could have reached here. The pebbles made sense. Almost all of the passageways so far had been thin and narrow, so rocks would break apart in tiny bits as the water rolled over the limestone. But here, there were no massive holes above. Maybe the chamber was weaker than the surrounding passages, and the boulders broke apart in large chunks in some catastrophic and rumbling cave-in that happened some unknown millennia ago. It's easy to think about caves in the past tense. They're usually formed over millions of years, which is an unthinkable timescale for humans. The dark and silent passages of caves feel like they were completed in ancient times. The raging waters and glaciers that cut through the rock had long since dried out, leaving empty, abandoned, and dead tunnels shrouded in darkness. But, as any caver unlucky enough to witness it will tell you, These caves and the waters that form them are still very much alive with activity. Charles washed away his thoughts of the boulders and the stillness that surrounded them as they climbed the rocks to find a thin layer of stone with a gap below the ceiling. They crawled through it, trekked through another passage, up through a hole, and across various other twists and turns until they reached a connection to County Pot. This cave was well known, and ropes were in place to help cavers descend into the shadows below. This section could have been the end of their journey. The rope led to an entrance high overhead that extended out into the open air above. Water can easily flood this section, making travel impossible beyond this point. Charles and his team squinted up to see only a small stream of water trickling down. They pressed on. Through a series of holes, they entered another boulder with a huge platform in the center. There, the group climbed up the rocks along the wall and through another narrow cutaway near the ceiling. After more twists and turns, they entered the main waterway of this portion of the cave before entering Molluscan Hall. This area was named for the shells of dead creatures that were deposited here from the waters above, and the rocky walls here were formed from ancient shells that were compressed into stone. Although the waters up to this point were tame, the waters here were loud and aggressive. In the main section before the hall, waters were frothing and splashing against the rocks. The flow brought cold drafts of air, and the sound filled the chamber, creating a painful wall of noise. The team started to worry as they tiptoed over narrow cliffs to reach the hall. Charles had to grasp the walls of the cave as he shimmied across the walkway. His gruff hands struggled against the small handholds along the way. Charles got a little dizzy when he realized that his strength couldn't save him here. If he fell, he was a goner. Once inside Molluscan Hall, Charles and his team took a much-needed break. They rested their gear against the walls, and one of them sat down on the muddied floor. They started eating some energy bars and traded stories about their Christmas plans. Some had already opened presents the night before. One caver told them his wife had given him a gift the day before, and he wished he could take her to experience this thrilling adventure. She told him many times her outdoor spirit was as far as the woods, and that was it. She wasn't moved by his dream of caving together, and she asked him to get home soon. He would have to clean up and look nice for the family coming over for Christmas dinner. Charles could relate. He laughed and threw his body against the rocky side of Molluscan Hall. As he leaned against the sides of the chamber to take some pressure off his feet, he thought of his own family safe and warm up above. He could almost hear the laughter of children reaching for stockings and the crackling of a fireplace. Except the sound got louder. It started to sound almost hollow and full of low, rumbling bass. The quick snaps he heard in his head crested into a tremendous roar as the rock split over his head. A massive boulder dislodged from the ceiling, rolling down another rock and sliding into Charles. Dust and dirt showered Molluscan Hall as his friends shielded their eyes and ducked for cover. A cloud of dust still hovered in the air after the rumbling stopped. One friend called out, asking if everyone was all right. The other friend reached out and grabbed him, whispering to be quiet. Any loud sounds could shake more dust loose and cause a deeper rock slide. These two were accounted for, but Charles was silent. As the dust settled, they saw what had happened. The impact of the boulder had thrust Charles to the ground and pinned his leg to the rocky floor below. Even through dust, without full vision of the scene, the cavers could see that Charles's foot and part of his lower leg were bent upward in an impossible direction. They scrambled to the ground and wrestled with the boulder. In the best-case scenario, Charles could walk it off and climb out of the cave. Otherwise, he could be injured, and in that case, the boulder could cut off circulation. In a worst-case scenario, moving the boulder could cause more damage if it rolled the wrong way, or if the pressure bent his bones as it rolled off of him. His friends weren't thinking about the possibilities. They heaved the freshly carved stone off of him, sending it rolling a few times down the grooved floor of the cave. As the boulder's thudding tumble came to a halt, they bent down and tried to communicate with Charles, but he gave no response. He lay motionless on the floor as his friends gingerly checked for his breath and pulse. He was alive, but they couldn't risk moving him. In the chaos of the cave-in, they weren't sure what part of him the boulder had hit. Even though he had no visible head injuries, moving him could cause permanent damage to his nerves, or cause any internal damage rupture, sending blood or cerebral fluid into his brain. His leg was still twisted from the impact, but it flopped to the floor, completely broken where the boulder had been. Blood began to soak through his overalls. He had a compound fracture that pushed his shin through his skin. There was no way Charles was getting out of Molluscan Hall without help. One caver instructed the other to stay with their unconscious friend while he climbed the rope out of the nearest exit. At around 6 p.m., just a short time before they were scheduled to leave the cave, the climber exited the nearby pothole. He immediately called for help. Emergency personnel contacted the Clapham Cave Rescue Organization. The Clapham team is one of the most elite rescue squads in the UK. They dispatched 30 volunteers to the scene, each equipped with their signature red jackets emblazoned with the logo of the British Cave Rescue Council. Along with the main group, 9 other volunteers from the Kendall Mountain Rescue Team and the Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association also joined them. The Kendall squad specializes in outdoor rescues in snowy environments. They come well equipped with thermal protection, and their off-road ambulances would be vital for reaching the obscure entrance that Charles and his team used to enter the E-Skill system. The teams brought helmets in case more falling rock was dislodged during the rescue. They also brought radios and rock shoring equipment to break apart any boulders that might have cut off the exits. Reports said the boulder had been moved off of Charles, but that could mean it was a few feet away from him or a few inches. They had to be sure they had enough space to get him out. It only took rescuers 20 minutes to arrive at an entrance closer to the hall. In the meantime, Charles had woken up. His pain was intense, but only his leg was seriously hurt. The rest of him was fine. As adrenaline shot through his body, he frantically told his friend that they needed to get out of this chamber. His friend helped him walk his hands up the side of Molluscan Hall so he could stand on his one good leg. Together, they bravely inched toward the main chamber below the nearest pothole. But after only a few minutes, the pain gripped him once more, and Charles couldn't go any further. Together, they stayed on the rocky floor and waited. Minutes later, rescuers rappelled and climbed down the nearby rope. They saw Charles almost immediately and administered painkillers to quell his screaming. The team busted out a kit and used it to split his leg to prevent more damage. Together, the rescuers lifted him onto a solid stretcher and carried him to the vertical chamber. His massive body complicated this step. He was a little too long for the stretcher, and his weight challenged the rescuers to maintain their grip and balance as they waddled through the cave. The third caver had to wait at the bottom while the team connected the stretcher to the ropes. Since the cave already had anchor points and ropes, the rescue operation was smooth and fast. They only needed some extra hand to hold Charles's weight. It only took them an hour to get him out of the pothole. Once at the surface, the teams brought him to the awaiting Kendall team ambulance. Normally, rescues end here, but the next part of the trip was just as hazardous as the cave. The snowy weather had met with a warm front, turning the snow into a thick mist that blinded the roadways. After a slow drive, they rendezvoused with a second ambulance waiting at Bullpot Farm, the humble abode where many caving teams travel to prior to their adventures below ground. Even though the rescue team got to Charles quickly, the return drive stretched the total rescue time to over 6 hours. It was midnight when the rescue ended. By then, Christmas had come and gone. Charles was safe, but he, his crew, and the 39 rescuers all missed their scheduled holiday plans. That's one of the many sacrifices that professional cavers have to make. To support their fellow spelunkers, they remain on call 24/7. Instead of dinner and presents, Charles celebrated the gift of life with his friends and family, all thanks to the brave rescuers who dared to venture into the depths of Molluscan Hall. Spending Christmas in a cave wasn't a cheerful experience for our unlucky cavers, but was your holiday any better? Let us know your stories in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and also subscribe for more amazing stories.